NBC News correspondent Julia Ainsley is reporting from Washington, D.C. Also joining us is NBC News senior national political reporter Jonathan Allen. We also have Washington Post congressional investigations reporter and MSNBC contributor Jacqueline Alemany. Good afternoon to all three of you. Julia, let's start with this. The Ethics Committee spoke to more than 24 witnesses, reviewed nearly 14,000 documents. As you've been going through it, what are some of the things that stand out and any surprises based on what we had on earlier reporting?
Yeah, Richard, well, this committee, the investigators did what good investigators do, and they followed the money. I want to read this stat to you. They tracked more than $90,000 to 12 different women over that 5-year time period. You said 2017 to 2020. That is notable, looking at the way Gaetz is responding to this, saying, oh, he's giving money to someone he's dating that they didn't ask for. And he's trying to make a distinction that wasn't prostitution. Another thing they found, and I think this is worth noting for accuracy, is that with all of the women that were interviewed by the committee, they all stated that their sexual activity with Gaetz was consensual. But at least one woman felt that the use of drugs and parties at events may have impaired their ability to really know what was going on or give full consent. That matters, especially as we question why we're learning all about this through a House committee report and not being charged by prosecutors. A DOJ statement has said from a senior DOJ official has told NBC News that the federal sex trafficking allegations would not have stood up and that they would have brought charges if they thought they had a winning case. Richard.
Jonathan, from that reporting that you heard from Julia, as well as your own, and looking through this report, what stands out to you and any surprises?
Yeah, I don't think there are any huge surprises here, Richard, because we had heard rumors of all this. Obviously, it's much different to be put into print under the flag of a congressional committee, specifically the Ethics Committee. In terms of Matt Gaetz's reputation, this is very damaging to him. He's somebody who has been thinking about running for governor of Florida. He's somebody who was named as the attorney general pick for Donald Trump before withdrawing amid, possible likely rejection by the United States Senate. And so, he says that he didn't do anything wrong. He says that these charges aren't true and that if they were, he would have been prosecuted in a court of law. For now, what we have is the Ethics Committee saying he did a bunch of things, including they believe it's credible that he had sex with an underage girl, and that will go down on his permanent record.
Jacqueline, the Republican chair of the Ethics Committee, released a statement saying, in part, while I do not challenge the committee's findings, I did not vote to support the release of the report, and I take great expectation that the majority deviated from the committee's well-established standards and voted to release a report on an individual no longer under the committee's jurisdiction, an action the committee has not taken since 2006. But last hour on MSNBC, Democratic committee member Glenn Ivey defended its release. Take a listen.
The reason the Ethics Committee exists is to make sure our members know what they can do, what they can't do, what crosses the line and what doesn't. And so I think issuing the report certainly provides guidance on that front as well.
Now, Jacqueline, the decision to release the report was a reversal from November, as you know, when the committee was deadlocked on it. Then we had this vote on December 5th. We get the report today during a Christmas week, as Matt Gaetz has noted. Eve is what he had said. What are the implications of the decision and what the panel has found so far?
Yeah, Richard. Well, we also talked to Glenn Ivey in the aftermath of the release of the report, and he noted that he felt like, one, there has been precedent, at least 4 different examples that have been previously cited by Democratic members on the committee of a report being released after the fact. You actually even have one former member, Charlie Rangel, still fighting some of the allegations that came out in the ethics report that was released by the committee after he had already resigned from his post. But also the fact that it was important to release this report to provide guidelines for what is acceptable and what is not acceptable from a member of Congress. There was a feeling from Democrats and at least one Republican member who sided with Democrats to vote with the majority to release this because on this GOP-led panel, that's what it was required in order for this report to be released to the public, that there was a need to make sure that Gates didn't get away with sustained behavior while he was a member of Congress that was considered not just inappropriate by other members, but also, as the report concluded, to have violated some laws and House rules and regulations. Ivey also told us that he felt that the panel's work was an important public good, that as this person goes forward and potentially seeks higher office or might receive some sort of appointment from Donald Trump now that he has withdrawn from Attorney General, perhaps in a different agency or area of the government, that the public should know what exactly Gates was doing and outlining the kinds of behaviors that he was engaged in.
You know, Julia, as you were looking through the report, something that stood out was the statement of not getting information or sharing information with the Department of Justice, saying that it refused to provide significant evidence to the committee and that it caused significant delays to the committee investigation along the way. What's to be made of those statements in this report? One side might say, well, this is different branches of the government, so they wouldn't support or necessarily share information. The other side might say they are both looking at the same individual and accusations of these specific actions, that they should work together. What do you make of that?
Well, I've certainly covered many investigations going back to, say, Robert Mueller's investigation that was run, through an FBI appointment at the same time Congress was also looking at Russian interference. So there are a lot of times we've had these things happening at the same time. Secret Service investigation of them and the assassination attempt this summer. Oftentimes investigations run concurrently and can come up with very different information. But I do think there are a lot of questions for the Justice Department regarding that, and also why we never saw charges. Repeatedly, we heard that this investigation was on hold. We've started hearing about Gates in 2021 because they were going to let the DOJ process play out. And then, of course, they didn't bring charges. We were told by a senior DOJ official today that it's career prosecutors who made the decisions not to bring charges. That was not a decision made by Merrick Garland or anyone in a political position who might have made that decision so as not to seem that they were putting their finger on a political scale. Instead, it was made by career prosecutors. But lots of questions there as to why, with all of this evidence we have now, they didn't think that there were some charges, except they do say that they don't think that they could have brought federal sex trafficking charges. And that seems to bear out in what we're learning today, Richard.
One of the distinctions here when we look at it, Jonathan, is the 17-year-old girl in 2017. This report saying that he did have sex with that 17-year-old. The DOJ not finding the same outcomes, not the prosecutors there not taking action. What do you think about those two different views of the same specifics of this case?
Well, Richard, this may not surprise you, but I was not in the room. So I don't know in terms of what actually happened there. I do think that with regard to what Julie was saying about these concurrent investigations, it's important to remember that that there are sort of different bars for prosecution, for the Justice Department to believe that a crime was committed, meaning they may believe that crimes were committed and not go forward with the prosecution because they believe that they can't win or for other reasons. And then there's the bar of the Congressional Ethics Committee, which is what Congressman Ivey was talking about in terms of outlining conduct that is appropriate or inappropriate within the halls of the House and among the House members. And so, there are sort of different standards here. And the ethics standard is obviously one that is lower than the standard for prosecution in terms of having confidence in what you're putting in a report. But as to whether or not Matt Gaetz had sex with a 17-year-old, again, there's only a couple people who really know that for sure.
Yeah, there are two bodies deliberating on what may or may not have happened. Well distinguished there. Jackie, 5 o'clock is in front of us for Matt Gaetz, at least. There's also, again, that the DOJ did not share information with this this report, but potentially this report was shared with DOJ. And if so, or if not, what does that mean for DOJ going forward? Might they have some new data, new evidence that may bring some new action in this case?
That is a really good question. And so far from what we've learned from some of the dribs and drabs that have been leaking out about the DOJ's investigation over the course of now it's been nearly half of a decade, have indicated that the DOJ might have access to far more information than the Ethics Committee did. And at the earlier this summer, we actually reported that the Ethics Committee was upset with the Justice Department for not providing more of the evidence and information that they had obtained through their investigatory process in that case. But we do know that the New York Times had obtained one spreadsheet that showed a vast array of women and men who were involved with these payments, indicating that perhaps hundreds of witnesses participated in a grand jury investigation and grand jury proceedings about this case. It's really unclear what the DOJ is going to do, if anything, with some of the raw materials that the Ethics Committee is likely going to hand over. And now that Gates is no longer under consideration for Attorney General, it sort of renders any sort of Senate Ethics Committee follow-up investigation moot as a part of the confirmation process. But I wouldn't be surprised if there was maybe further action on some of the findings that the Ethics Committee came to a conclusion about. For example, the fact that Gates had sex with a 17-year-old in July of 2017, that they concluded was in violation of Florida's statutory rape law.